Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will now kickstart our next session. May we first invite Prof. Ben Kershaw up on stage for his opening remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very excited to be here to give some opening comments on a really important panel today, which is part of our Festival of Ideas. So I first want to extend to you a warm welcome to this year's Lim, Tiam, Seng lecture series, which we're making part of this festival. The event is made possible through the generous endowed gift from Mr. Lim Tiam Seng to the Institute of Water Policy, IWP, which is now known as the Center for Water Policy, CWP, new acronym, same thing, which is a flagship program of the now 2-year-old Institute for the Environment and Sustainability, IES, or as we say, EYES on the world. And it was created 2 years ago when Dean Danny Claus said, look, water is great, but as we'll hear about today, it's part of a broader set of sustainability challenges. So let's bring all of our lenses on public policy that we do in Singapore, Southeast Asia, and the world to think about all things that are important and their interactions across them as well. And that's been going really well, and this is one of our many efforts now under that program. Mr. Lim, the founder of Chip Eng Seng Corporation Limited, has played an instrumental role in transforming his company into one of Singapore's leading contractor and property developers. His gift to the university underscores the importance of leadership in shaping resilient, sustainable futures, an ethos that aligns perfectly well with today's theme of sustainability and urban water management. And I did want to take the time to acknowledge that we do stand at the midpoint of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And despite some really important successes that we can talk about today and throughout our efforts in general, many governments, private sector, and non-governmental organizations are frustrated with the pace and scale of change that have been identified as critical for meeting the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, of which climate change, both mitigating and adapting to, are immediate and pressing priorities. And we know, I mean, you know, every year is the hottest year on record, right? So I've been giving this lecture for 30 years on climate change, and every year I say, last year was the hottest year on record. And every year I'm correct, right? Which is good and bad, right? So we know that, therefore, despite now all the attention, and I must say, you know, I've been looking at this for 30 years, I've never seen so much attention now to these issues. There's a real chance to make a difference given the accelerating nature of policy as part of that process. And that's really exciting. But how we get there and use that, that attention is what we're doing today and in the future as well. So we know, therefore, that these barriers remain, these blockages remain that we have to remove, and the accelerants have to be applied to make a difference. And that the difference requires making sure that whatever we do is tailored to unique social, institutional, environmental contexts of individual communities, as well as across the globe. And there is where water becomes a powerful enabler. And water practitioners have a unique opportunity, and I would argue responsibility, to lead in delivering innovative, integrated water management at the urban scale that can both operationalize and address climate actions. I would actually argue the lessons from water management apply so well to the broader set of sustainability challenges. But how we do that and quickly is what's facing all of us. So, as part of that, we are honored to have our distinguished speaker today, Professor Tony Wong. By the way, he works on water, I work on forests. We first met about, I don't know, 5 months ago or so. The most amazing conversation about the need to bring different lenses to the table to make a difference. And this is why I'm really excited to hear from him shortly. He is Professor of Sustainable Development at Monash University, who will deliver, of course, our keynote. And our moderator for today's panel, Professor Cecilia Tortajada, who is currently Professor in Practice Environmental Innovation at the School of Social and Environmental Sustainability, University of Glasgow, who was also at IWP for many years, who I had the honor of working with on an evaluation of the Fenner School of the Environment about, 8 years ago, or 9 years ago? Again, looking at different disciplines around common purpose for impacts. So just quickly now, I know I'm speaking way past my time. Always a danger to ask a professor to say anything, right? We speak in like 1 hour increments, not like 5 minutes. Professor Wang brings vast expertise and profound insights into sustainable development, water management, and urban resilience. His perspective will be invaluable as we explore the ways in which water can be leveraged to drive progress towards the SDGs and climate action. With that, I invite you to engage fully with the thought-provoking discussions ahead, and now pass the time to our moderator, Professor Cecilia Tortajada. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to all of you for being here. I am going to give an introductory presentation to the presentation of Professor Tony Wong. And this is very much to set the scene of the situation of water in the world. This is something we tend to see, that there is a certain amount of water in the world, that most of it is on the sea, and that only a little bit is a small percentage is fresh water. What we don't discuss is what that small amount of fresh water, what does it mean in terms of socioeconomic development and protection of the environment? And this is the part we tend to forget. This is how the world looks. We have green, of course, where we have rainfall. And so should we develop according to the water we have? And not necessarily, because we have many other resources, many other needs. But as Ben said, water has to be considered. Because in addition to water, we have, for example, the global population. And so how many people there are in each country and where are they living? And this is where our problems start, because it's basically in terms of water availability per capita, water that is scarce and polluted, and for which every time we need more. There are, like Ben said, there are the impacts of climate change. And this is from the NASA Observatory, where we see for recent events, are they affecting water? They are, but they are affecting people. They are affecting socioeconomic activities. They are affecting the environment. In this case, we have, I included examples from different parts of the world. This is in the United States. This is in fires that are created because of droughts. And we know when you have droughts, the temperatures are higher, you have less precipitation, more dependence on groundwater when this is available. We have another example, which is very near from here, which is Yagi, and we have seen how it has affected different populations. And about how people are affected, this is an example, flash floods in Sudan. The way in which climate change is affecting different countries, different regions of the world, has more or less impact depending on the institutions, on governance aspects, on the capacity not only to protect the people, but also to, we use the word resilience, but resilience is so vague, it says so little. But basically for people to survive, for people to be living in better conditions. Can they recover their house? Will they have to be relocated? Would they have a job? And nobody knows at this point. There are countries which are better prepared than others, and Sudan is not one of the countries that is well prepared, not for floods, not for drought, not for every day. We talk about crisis in the world. We tend to use the word a lot, and this is very much man-made. This is because of over-abstraction of groundwater. This is because of over-allocation of water in the rivers. Because in each one of these examples, you will see the population growth, because population has a lot to do. But again, also institutions, also policies, how they are implemented, financial situation. Like if we have a drought in the United States, it's very different from a drought extended drought in Mexico, in Brazil, or in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa, because our countries are more or less prepared for the different events, and because this has an enormous impact on the populations. How would it look, the groundwater depletion, if these were mountains these were mountains? And this is the way it would look. We use more in South Asia because it is available and because there is no control. That's why there are no policies, and one policy leads to another one which is more difficult to implement. And we come to the water policies. Are they important? How are they important? How are we using them? Are we using them for water supply and sanitation? Because wastewater management is non-existent in developing countries, except perhaps in the case of China. Do we have it for the famous case of resilience? Do we have it for climate change? How do we implement one or two or three policies with the capacity the institutions have at the national, provincial, or state level and at the local level, when the problems are so different and when we have only a certain amount of money? And for this, let me talking about the water policies. We tend to develop policies in the absence of other sectors. And this is an example of energy use. We want to grow in the world, and every right to grow. The world is ambitious, and this comes in terms of energy use and energy production. And the energy production has a water cost, not only in terms of footprint, but actual water use and quantity and quality. And we are worried about climate change. We want to be net zero, which is a policy, a goal that is very far away. And a very big group, well, we have said we want to reach the net zero, we want to reduce emissions, and we are producing still energy with fossil fuels, because that's what we have. The green energy is growing, but not to the same extent. And Google, for example, we all know, many of us use, except perhaps in China. And Google said that according to their operations, the data centers, they would be net zero by 2030. But this was just the reverse. Just in 1 year, their emissions grew by 13%. And the same is in the case of Microsoft. Their emissions continue growing. So we have a certain amount of water. Rivers are over-allocated. Water is polluted. And we have a new user, which is very important. Will we renounce to our goal to be cleaner, to be more connected? Because that requires energy. And energy requires the water that we don't have. Are we going to take the water from another user? Are we going to stop industries? Will we allocate less water to the agricultural sector? And these are questions that are not being asked, much less answered. So who is asking these questions? And I'm going to give two examples, a small country and a big country, a city-state. This is Singapore, where at every step of the water cycle, our water cycle is linear, right? So there's really not a cycle. But if we see in the case of Singapore, this is, of course, a very general view of the water cycle. Every part of it is taught. Every part of it has how it's going to affect which sector. How is it going to affect Singapore? Can we have more industries if they produce more water? Do we have to produce more new water? Do we have to desalinate more water? Because that has an environmental cost also and an energy cost. So what is it that we have to do? And in this, what is it that we have to do is that planning is a very, very important part. So this is an example of a place where there is thinking. So how do we plan for the future? The next one, which of course is a completely different dimension, is China and India. What I want to show here is the GDP, how it has grown and how China is much bigger than India now. And I mention this not because it's a comparison, but because in terms of population, they are beyond above 1 billion. In the case of China, the government of China has identified that every year, with every flood, due to the damages, they are losing 1% of GDP. Now, this translates in a lot of money, and this translates in agricultural, infrastructure losses, and also in terms of life losses. But then China is thinking, what is it that we are going to do? In the plan, in the 14 5-year plan for social and economic development, water scarcity, has been brought up to the top. And then what is it that China is saying? We are going to have our KPIs, water conservation, water production, digitalization, artificial intelligence, capacity building, and they ask a lot of questions. If we want to forget water secure, if we want to develop, and like Ben was saying many times, it's about the water you have, quantity and quality. So if we want to develop, by 2025, what type of infrastructure do we need? Do we continue developing the large infrastructure which is needed because of the floods? Do we develop more the small one? And the truth is that you need all type of infrastructure. We don't like gray infrastructure, but we need it. We need the gray, the green, the blue, and every other color you can think of. So what infrastructure do we need? What type of financing do we need? Do we need to involve the private sector, and to what level? Because it's very much government supported. And how is it going to, the governments are going to, should contribute? What role should they play? What type of research and development, this is the part we should be interested on, what type of research and development should we be undertaking? But this is with the focus of water, because it has been identified that water is not about rhetorics, water is having an impact on socioeconomic development. And for this, let's remember, these are the resources we have. And with climate change, this map is going to change. So we have many changes, many challenges, many opportunities. So for our socioeconomic activities, for water conservation, for water production, and yesterday there was a very interesting panel where it was said that we should go for the different type of energy. No, we shouldn't. We should think what resources we have to support that type of energy. Because if not, we continue making the same mistake, assuming that water will be available when precipitation patterns have and are changing. So this is just an introduction for Professor Wong's presentation, and with this, I would welcome you to the podium, please.
Okay, that's fine. Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Ben, for a great introduction. In fact, it's a great scene setting because your introduction was helps me get across some of my early messages very quickly. And thank you, Cecilia, for backgrounding my presentation. Look, I'll get straight to the chase. There's a bit to get through, and then I've got a tight schedule, or you have a tight schedule, and I'll start with 2015. 2015 was a very good year. It's a year I remember very well, but it's been a long time ago now, but it was a year I remember for a number of reasons. 2015 was a good year because that was when we had hope. We started, in terms of climate actions, Agenda 2030, because it was in 2015 that the United Nations, the collections of many nations in the world, signed an agreement on Agenda 2030. That was in September 2015. And I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals, and so on. But 2015 was also a very good year for climate action. Again, many nations came together with the Paris Agreement and signed a binding agreement to try and keep global temperature rise to 2 degrees and maybe even reach for 1.5 degrees. A great year for hope, a great year for global actions. So last year, at the midpoint of Agenda 2030, we asked ourselves, how are we traveling? And perhaps 2030 was not a good year because in the UN conference at mid-year, there was a clear message that we are falling behind. In fact, I think the Secretary General of the United Nations talked about the need for a global rescue plan. And that in every nation, we are falling behind in all of our SDGs. And that in some cases, we have, in fact, increased, let alone some of our falling even further behind our targets than when we started in 2015. Depressing, yeah? That was last year. And then we look at some of the results of temperature rise in last year. Equally depressing. That at the rate that we are going, we're not going to hit our 2-degree target. We're going to go higher. And that we are already experiencing all of the early signs of the impact of global warming. As Ben talked about the notion of every year is a record year. I mean, it is. And this year is no better than last year. This year is again another record year. There are countries and there are cities that are experiencing climate conditions that they've never experienced before. You know, cyclonic activities have come further south, from my perspective, into Sydney. Yeah? And most of our understanding of climates actually drives a lot of our infrastructure development. And now we realize that we are facing conditions that we've never faced before. So it's pretty depressing. And I've been reflecting on this and asked a fundamental question, that there is no shortage of national aspirations for climate actions, for Agenda 2030. They've signed the damn document. Why are we not able to operationalize those national policies and commitments? In the end, that is the question. And my sense is that really context is everything, and that it lies in our inability to contextualize lessons and exemplars from other places in the world. Like I said, there are no shortage of maybe pilot scale from a global perspective of exemplars on what the future should look like. But many of us, are unable to take that lesson and contextualize it, operationalize it to the context that we're working in. Different government, different scale, different capacity. There's no point expecting a nation, a city, with a different level of technical capacity to embrace the type of technology we're offering. So we're not thinking about transitions. We're simply thinking about cookie cutting. And there lies, in my mind, the problem. Now, from a water perspective, we have talked about the need for urban systems to be integrated and adaptive. And we often, in a lot of, and me included, in a lot of forums say, look at what we're doing in Singapore. Look at what we're doing in Australia. Well, it's upon us as well. It is not enough to just show what we're doing. It is very important for us to say, what does that mean to you in Hyderabad, in India? What does it mean to you in Mumbai? What does it mean to you in China? Because that is the only way that we can foster change, is to be able to take the next step and say, how does the lesson, how can that be adapted to the context that is relevant to you? And of course, we're in Singapore. Before I get into Singapore, water. I now want to talk about water because that's where my expertise is. That's where, as Ben said, it's a significant enabler, because when we shift from a focus on climate mitigation to climate adaptation, we suddenly realize that when we move to that, it's not an energy question anymore. It's not a fossil fuel question anymore. It is about how do we now create the capacity for climate impact adaptation. And when you look at that, and most of you would have seen the film Inconvenience Truth, if you go back and have a look at it, almost every impact that we see in Inconvenience Truth is actually about water. Not enough of it, too much of it, yeah? inappropriate timing, its impact on food. They're all about water, and therefore, my view is that water practitioners must take on the leadership role in fostering Agenda 2030 and fostering climate actions because of water being pervasive in so many issues that we deal with. So on that note, and our inability to operationalize policies, how do we actually adapt lessons, good lessons that we have to global context? And I actually don't have an answer for you, but I'll give you some examples. And of course, we're in Singapore before, and here's another, I'm ahead of my slide. Water as an enabler is also something that actually cuts across both biophysical, policy, and social. And I just want to just present a little bit of work that my university have done for a while now, and actually look at how water and good water management policies permeate through the SDGs. And we map that. And if you look at that diagram in here, we basically found that of the 169 SDG targets, water directly influenced 50 of them. That whatever water actions you take influence 50 of the 169 targets. So it's not SDG 6 that we are really talking about. It is actually how water permeates through all the others. But when you look deeper, we found that it also enabled another 34 SDG targets. Now, if you add them up, really, water directly or indirectly influenced half the SDG targets. So I just want to get you to think about the strategic importance of good water management in that regard. Okay, lessons. I'd like to acknowledge the work of Cecilia, fantastic piece of work in terms of the Singapore water story. And of course, the main logo now on PUB in terms of the water story. And I put this slide up simply to basically say, we talk about our aspirations for urban systems that are integrated and adaptive. That's not quite, but similar to saying we want world peace. Great. Now, how do you operationalize that to a context that is relevant to you? And I asked a question, like ICE have a agenda of public policies. And I think when I met with some of your colleagues, Ben, I asked the question, is your focal point Singapore or the region? And it's the region. Well, in that case, I say that it is as much a challenge for you to actually being able to contextualize a lot of your thinking, the Singapore example, to the region, because there are big differences. As I'm sure all of you would have heard conversations of the Singapore bubble. Right? I was in Toronto 2 weeks ago, and there was a big Singapore delegation that talks about all its achievements, and everybody is completely overawed by, Singapore and its achievements. But then I hear, but it's not relevant to me. It's not relevant to my, and I put the challenge to you, Ben, to make it relevant. Yeah? Because the lessons in Singapore are great, but many people have said that the institutional construct, the size, the affluence, makes a lot of the solution not relevant. And I want to drill down to that and say, well, how do we make it relevant? We'll go through that, and then I'll come back to perhaps answering that. Now, Singapore is, of course, has significant water scarcity issues in spite of the amount of rain, and that's because of its geopolitical position, its dependency on Malaysia for the catchments that it needs to get the water. And very early on, Singapore adopted a policy to diversify its water sources. And most of you would have heard about the 4 national taps. There's a reason for that. It is an ambition to be self-reliant, an ambition to break its nexus with the cross-jurisdictional ownership of water, because climate change will get every nation to think about how to secure the resilience, water resilience of their own country ahead of any geopolitical treaty that might occur. Yeah? And every country is actually re-evaluating how do they strengthen their own water resilience. And that won't be long before that first tap water from Johor is going to be a discussion that will be more and more difficult. Yeah, understandably so. So Singapore embarked on diversifying its water sources in terms of seawater desalination, and then of course significant breakthrough in used water, reuse of used water, the new water, significant achievement in that. And that over time gave Singapore the confidence that if it can treat wastewater, it can treat anything, which then embarked on the fourth tap, that of really looking at harvesting every drop of rain that fell in Singapore. And to some degree, that was how I got involved in Singapore, because when we look at harvesting every drop of rain, we also got to realize that when it rains, it cleanses our catchment. The relationship between stormwater harvesting and land use planning really now come into full. How we manage our land use, the type of policy that influence how land is being used, directly influence the level of treatment and the treatability of stormwater. Right? So the fourth national TAPS drove a new wave of government decision and interventions, which is often referred to as ABC waters, whereby even the concept of looking at stormwater as a resource got PUB and Singapore government to rethink about water, and it's no longer water for life, but water for livability. Because the way that we capture and treat the stormwater before it gets to, say, Marina Bay, right, actually influence the way land use planning and landscapes in cities are to be delivered. So we found, for instance, that a lot of the concepts that was developed in Australia, which I was very fortunate to lead in terms of water-sensitive design, was actually embraced in Singapore. And of course, Singapore will not call it water-sensitive urban design because that's an Australian term, right? So it was referred to as ABC waters. Active, beautiful, and clean. Active in terms of how water in the landscape activates your site. Beautiful place, point of destination for people to visit and so on. Beautiful in terms of how that actually improves the quality of the amenity of that, and clean, as in the cleansing function of those nature solutions. The picture to your bottom right was one of the first piloting of what that means in Singapore. It was the Balam Estate Rain Garden, built in 2008, and of course I was very much part of that. When I came earlier this year, I went and had a look at it. 15 years on, amazing, right? That it is being preserved. It continued to provide the cleansing function of the local area that drains into the Balam Estate, and well maintained as a landscape that is part of the landscape, but actually serving and providing an ecosystem service, that being the cleansing of water to that degree. But there are other projects as part of ABC Water. One was, of course, the naturalization of the Kallang Canal at Bishan Park, and its ability to actually maintain its function as a flood conveyance during storm, but as a significant parkland now that actually brings the level of amenity and destination, activate the development or the HDB development around there. Beautiful as a natural landscape rather than a concrete canal, but still providing that function of drainage, as you can see in that slide. those exemplars then led to significant reform in policy. And the significant reform in policy was the HDB policy in the first instance. And how HDB, as a matter of policy, now deliver ABC waters in all of its development. And the latest of that is in the Bada in that park. Anyway, right, which I was alerted to. And of course, you only need to Google that park to see the type of HDB developments that came from there. Yeah? And one of the things that I must commend Singapore is that when they do something, they do it bloody well. Yeah? But the fact is that those examples at Balam Estate in 2008, the Kallang, the Bishan Park, actually were very important reference point that seeds the change in policy, in corporate policy, in government policy. But change in policy in itself is not enough. You need to ensure that the sector, the industry, has the capacity to deliver on that policy. Yeah? And so as part of the ABC waters, there were guidelines to codify the exemplars that we see. So now a combination of technical guidelines and reference points, Balam Estate, Bishan Park, meant that people can now actually start to acquire the capabilities to deliver on the policies. And as part of that, working with PUB, working with the Institute of Architects and the Institute of Engineers, we developed training courses. And both PUB required accreditation of ABC water practitioners, which provided the incentive for the private sector to go to that courses to get accredited so that they can deliver on HDB projects and ABC water projects. So that they are the chain of events of, first of all, concepts and broad aspirations to diversify your water that led to the 4th national TAP that influenced land use plannings, the demonstration of what could be on site that actually provided the evidence to evidence-based policies, both in government and in private sector, in HDB development. The guidelines that ensure that policies are implemented appropriately in building sectorial capabilities, and then the accreditation. They're all part of how you would operationalize broad agendas. Now, we are in a climate change scenario, and Singapore are facing the next wave, if you like, of challenge. No longer about water supply security, no longer about thinking about creating a livable city. It is about sea level rise. And this is the latest from the version 3 of the climate change report about the vulnerability of Singapore to sea level rise and the hotspots. And I want you to pay attention to the one right at the bottom to the right, because that's where Marina Bay is, that's where East Coast Park is. And many of you would have heard the conversation over the last year and a half about the Long Island project, right? Which is really a determination of basically saying, now what would we do to actually accommodate the sea level rise? And more importantly, the sea level rise coupled with increased cyclonic activities, increased density, intensity of low pressure systems that led to storm surges and heavy rainfall. The big three: sea level rise, storm surge, high rainfall. Yeah? And so what is this leading us to from a Singapore perspective? Singapore is progressively transitioning itself to become a polder city, because now they got all these dikes that they're trying to build to protect sea level rises. Okay? So what lessons can we learn from that? one of the things here is this is another plot of the type of intense rainfall that Singapore it can be expected. So sea level rise, storm surge, rainfall. And if you look at that, in the month of April, May, I think, in some areas, rainfall is expected to increase by 40%. If you think 10 years ago that Orchard Road was a river, well, it's going to be a river much more often if we didn't actually think about those situations. And now operating like a polder. That water is not freely running out to the sea because we've blocked it to basically stop sea level rise from impacting on Singapore. What lessons can we learn? These are some of the other results on looking at the type of rainfall intensity. And no matter how you look at it, you can conclude that rainfall intensities are going to increase in Singapore. And I want to draw your attention to some recent work that I was involved in with the city of Kunshan in China. Kunshan, as you can see, is a 6-minute by fast train outside of Shanghai to the west. That's the only way I can describe Kunshan because it's a county-level city. It's not one of those big cities, but it's a city of polders. There are over 100 polders in there. And we were, over a 10-year partnership with that city, we actually start to develop, okay, how does the city actually accommodate build resilience in climate? One of the things that we did in there was to build the Internet of Things. And here is where I sort of say the influence of digital technology on the way that we manage water. Because it's a polder, there are many canals in that city that basically are like standing water. There's nowhere to go because it's a polder, yeah? Unless you lift the gates or unless you pump them out, it's there. And in China, poor sanitation, those canals are polluted, yeah? And one of the first things we did was to introduce wetlands in that as a landscape solution and introduce water recirculation in each polder to that wetland. So think of it as we've built this giant swimming pool whereby the wetland is a filter and we run the water through the filter. And that has now been built to basically start to look at how do you improve the quality of that water. And the IoT, Internet of Things, was able to basically monitor the quality of the water and start the pump circulating in there. But at the same time, in building that, and why I brought that up is that one of the discussions that we're having with PUB is that, you know, the Long Island project, huge water body, but that huge water body actually has a very small catchment, unlike Marina Bay that has a big catchment. So the normal rainfall and the flow comes to actually give it a very natural circulation. Because, you know, if you don't believe me, just fill a tap of a bucket of water and just leave it in the sun for 3 or 4 days and see what happens to it. That's exactly what will happen to that water because it doesn't have enough flushing. So what do you need to do? That's exactly what was happening in Kunshan, and you need to actually start to think about how you introduce water management through filters and at the same time use that as a means of beautifying the place and activating the place. You don't have to run it like a swimming pool, but you can run it in a landscape design way to deliver a means of activating the space while maintaining the water quality. So that was what was done in there. And of course, through that, we had the Internet of Things to basically tell us when to manage the pumps and so on to be more responsive to that. And so that dashboard was set up for the city of Kunshan as a pilot. Yeah? And we were able to monitor the water levels and basically understand how different rainfalls actually behave in different channels. Because we did that in one polder, yeah, as a demonstration. As I say, every means of operationalize your work actually requires a means of engaging with government and community. And the best way you can do that is not go hypothetical, but go demonstration in that sense. So this is what we did, and we're able to show what it looks like in a flood situation and when to operate the gates. They are all gated, and when to operate the pumps and so on and so forth. How do you optimize the pump? Which basically are lessons that we could learn to say, well, how does that embedding of digital technology help Singapore meet its next challenge? Rising sea level, storm surge, increased rainfall. How do you meet that? I'd like to finish my talk with one really pressing issue that is not so water related in Singapore, but certainly water related in Australia, and that is heat. If there is one thing that Singaporeans would feel as the impact of climate change, it's not floods, it's not increased rainfall. What you will feel today and the next year and the year after next is actually increased heat wave days. You will feel that before you will feel the sea level rise and the floods. That influences your building policy. That influences how you actually design your future buildings. That influences how you design public spaces as points of refuge. It gets you to think about ensuring that you leave no one behind. Those that cannot afford air conditioning, and maybe there are not that many in Singapore, but there's a lot in Australia. Yeah. It needs, and in Australia, we are working very hard. And of course, in Melbourne, where I come from, we have what we call dry heat, not humid heat. So evapotranspiration and promoting water in the landscape, huge issue in creating places whereby the microclimate provides the refuge for people that can't afford air conditioning. Yeah, and there are many. In Singapore, evapotranspiration is probably not such a big solution because it's really humid. But shade and leveraging wind in creating refuge points in your public space design will become a significant issue for Singaporeans in that sense. Okay, I just want to point that out because you will feel this, and the imperative for doing something, especially for the vulnerable, the aged, right? The over 65, over 70, I think is going to be your next great challenge. So this is just more information from the V5 report that shows the number of heat wave days. And if you look at the numbers and you say, oh my goodness, it's a problem that is right at our doorsteps. So I like to finish by basically saying that, in fact, working in cities are incredibly complex. It is complex because cities are a melting pot of all the challenges that we talk about, but it is also the melting pot of all the disciplinary inputs that need to come together to solve that problem, right? Now, in Singapore, I have to say, and I mentioned it today, that the scale of Singapore is such whereby you probably can get away with fragmentization because of the structure of your government, quite a directive government. There's only one government compared to multi-governments, meant that you could probably get away with it. Because when I see Singapore and its institutional setup, it is still highly fragmented and highly focused on what their particular portfolio of that department is. And the level of cross-collaboration, in fact, could be better, really. But at the same time, when government ministers say you do this, quite often the government departments just do it. So, the imposition for cross-collaboration is much more through executive directions than actually the culture of cross-collaboration. And I think in Singapore you can get away with it. But for many other countries in your region, if you don't build the culture for cross-collaboration, you find that quite often those high-level initiatives get lost at the bureaucracy. And that, in fact, is why we are not meeting our SDG targets globally, because that just get lost or halted at the bureaucracy level. So, I leave you with this message, that we there's no shortage of innovation out there, no shortage of technology, no shortage of high-level government commitments. But in my mind, there are 3 key adoption initiatives that needs to come in place to operationalize those ambitions. And the first is what government needs to do. Government needs to establish what I refer to as enabling policy. There are so many policies that are input-driven rather than outcome-driven. Right? Government needs to really think about that. Think about integrating across different government agencies. If you are promoting integration, you need to set the example by first demonstrating how your different ministries and different departments actually co-invest and cooperate in some of those infrastructure that you are building, especially in a city whereby space is an issue and so on. Right? Second is about policies being outcome driven, and I can't stress that enough. That to enable innovation and to provide incentive for innovation in the private sector, you need to actually create the enabling policy, and therefore you need to set outcomes expectations, but not input expectations. And I completely subscribe to that. And of course, in fostering whole of government coordination and investment, it is only through that can you be serious about any form of public-private partnerships. Public-private partnerships globally are a hit and miss at the moment. And it's a hit and miss because government actually do not know how to do partnerships before they actually reach out to the private sector. So I leave you with that. The second point is about our sector, the industry. What do we, and what's our role in delivering adoption pathway? The first and foremost is actually a new economic valuation framework. A lot of our private sector projects are based on some sort of benefit cost analysis that is incredibly narrow, right? Completely reductionist. Yeah? And through that, you find that the economic valuation framework does not lend itself to any cross-sector collaboration because it actually doesn't account for or value the benefits that could be accrued to others. So an economic framework that actually captures all the benefits, both tangible and intangible, immediately sets for you the identification of all the beneficiaries. If you knew all the beneficiaries and are able to value all those benefits, they are the foundation to any co-investment discussions. Yeah? In fact, how you co-invest and how you actually offer partnership has to be founded on an understanding of beneficiaries and the values of those benefits. So I argue that you need to, and we all need to, and there's research going on, including at ICE, on actually framing a different economic valuation framework. And of course, professional development is definitely there. And again, I'm not a social scientist, but through my observation, I make the observation that change is very confronting for individuals, academics or in the profession. People become directors and managers because of their past practices. And then you tell them that their past practices need to change, right? How confronting is that for them? Well, I think that leadership, executives need to make some of those hard decisions and clear the deck maybe for the recalcitrants and make way for the youth because they actually hold the right aspirations and the right risk appetite to try new things. And I think that, for some of us, me included, we should maybe get out of the way. And finally, of course, the importance of social resilience. And I can speak a whole day about social resilience. But social resilience can only be harnessed based around awareness, knowledge, and empowerment. We need to actually have our community actually understand their vulnerability, include them in a lot of co-design of policy and implementation of works. And they are, if you like, some of the key things in my mind, those 3 key initiatives that are essential in how you will operationalize policies in this case. So I think basically start with that, we start with water, but it's really not just about water. But water is a great enabler to many of those discussions that I've discussed today. So thank you for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity. A great honor for me to speak here today to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for such an excellent presentation, for so many ideas. So we are in the Festival of Ideas. Before I ask the audience for questions, let me ask one. You have a lot of experience in terms of city, right? City development and community integration. And you showed to us what the climate change, what are the climate change projections for Singapore. And you mentioned that what Singapore is going to, Singaporeans and people living here will experience are higher temperatures, and the city would have to change. How can we imagine that city? How would it have to change in terms of refuge, you mentioned, but also infrastructure? How can one, I don't know, protect the water bodies? I don't know. How would it have to change? That's my first question. Second, is that being done anywhere at a smaller scale? Like, we are going to change, let's start planning for that.
Sure, look, that's a really good question. But, I put it to you that cities are constantly changing. All development areas are being renewed. In Singapore, I was at a NUS symposium, and there was discussion about, let's keep going with our land reclamation. Someone asked, what is the area of Singapore? And many of us say 700 square kilometers. I said, no, it's more like 1,400 if you look at the sea boundary that we have. Well, that's, I mean, it's a bit radical, but it nevertheless represents the fact that every city is constantly changing. And I'll give you an example with Melbourne. Melbourne is constantly changing with an emphasis on looking at developing greater density so that access to services, the idea of a 10-minute city is all there. And it's changing in terms of how new development, higher density development are clustered around transport hubs, how old industrial areas are being renewed into new mixed-use areas. So they're constantly changing. And so in theory, you can facilitate cities to progressively transform itself with the right enabling policy. You don't have to actually expect government to pay for everything. You just need to make sure that when private sectors come in to progressively renew your city, they actually are cognizant of the greater agenda of progressively turning a city to become more water resilient, to become more livable, to have more climate, urban heat mitigations. All of those things, if set in a policy context as the outcomes that you want, actually drive a lot of innovation on how people can actually deliver on those outcomes. So first of all, I think that when I say cities have to change, well, they are constantly changing, but more often than not, they are changing in terms of structure, in terms of density, but they are not changing in their broad system that accommodates what is a changing environment at the moment. So that's what I meant.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ching, please. Could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. Professor Wong, my name is Leong Ching. I work at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I'm an economist and I look at behavior and environmental behavior in particular. I know your work and it's a great privilege to see you and hear you in person. I have a question actually, and I know you said you're not a social scientist, but I'm afraid it's a social science question. But before I ask the question, if I may, I was really inspired by your lecture and the challenge you threw about the generalizability of the Singapore model. Actually, I wanted to say a lot of people look at Singapore now and think, well, we're not like that, right? But actually, and Cecilia will know this well, when Singapore started its water story, it was poor and fragmented in a political sense and facing severe scarcity in water. So GDP per capita was something like 500. Right? It's 89,000 now. Any country which is a GDP of 500 would find our lessons useful. And our population was entirely immigrant. So any country with a divisive politics will find it useful. And any country with a non-compliant population would find our early experience useful. So I would say that. The scale we can't change, but I would say maybe that will make us more applicable to countries. My question is this: you spoke quite a lot about infrastructure, like polders and institutions, and I think those are so important. I wonder, in terms of the people and in terms of our behavior of the public, what suggestions would you have for people who live in cities? How should we change our behavior? Thank you.
Sure, that's a really good question, and also, well, the two questions. Your first comment, it's fraught with landmines, depending on how I respond to that, because your institutional structure, your government structure is, it's often we call guided democracy, whereby it's highly corporatized. If the boss says you do certain things, you do it. Yeah, it's highly corporatized in that sense. Most countries doesn't run that way. Yeah, so it's and to be blunt, it's not helpful to say that that the rest of the world in our region or our region with a low GDP, right, has something to learn from us, because what are all the things that needs to align to get you to where you are now, right? It's quite different in other contexts. And also, where we are now today is also quite different from where we were before. Because I'll put it to you, how many countries, in 1960, right, felt that water is an issue of national security? How many countries? 0, except for Singapore. Because it was. Now, what incentivized a whole of government to rally other than to reference that it's a threat to national security? So the context is already completely different. The Lee Kuan Yew vision, right, was exactly that. So, you look at, and I mentioned today in the discussion that our ability to operationalize government policy gets more and more difficult as the country gets bigger and bigger, because it has a great diversity of political systems, social structure, and that the one national policy finds that it is actually very difficult to operationalize unless there is clear partnership with the local government to capture the local context and adapt that. Singapore didn't have that problem. Singapore have a national policy, its land mass is that, and it can operationalize that. And it operationalized that with a government structure that is, very hierarchical and very determined on this national agenda. So, I have not come across a country with that same underlying setting that allowed for the Singapore story to be of direct relevance to. But it doesn't mean that you can't actually dive deeper into those lessons and adapt key principles to drive that, which is what I'm trying to do in this case, in terms of saying the success story in Singapore, right? And I said that in Toronto 2 weeks ago in the World Water Congress, that if you are a city that has a significant level of autonomy, you can actually capture the Singapore story and do that. And the city of Kunshan that I worked in, county level city, has some enabling policy from the national government, but actually controls their own budget and their own economy and their own infrastructure delivery investment. So they could do it. And they did it in 10 years, which is, in my mind, amazing for a county level city to do that. Yeah? But if you then go to other countries whereby municipal level and state level policies completely just mirror the national, and they are almost like they are almost like delivering on the policy with no input. And you look at Indonesia, and look at how the different municipal government and provincial government operate, and you sort of realize that, in some sense, sometimes that's where the logjam is. Then the question is, how does the story of Singapore, which I use, motivate them to realize that they can actually achieve progress that is aligned with that? And so all I'm saying is that our challenge, all of us, is to be able to not leave it there and say, well, you figure it out, here's the story, but actually to take that extra step to understand the context and then try and say, hey, some of these broad principles can actually be applied to them. So that. Now, in terms of community, how do you actually engage community? It's really interesting. Like when I first came to Singapore to work on the ABC project, and you will all remember the Orchard Road flooding, which I was sort of in the middle of at the time. One of the things that I realized, which has changed a fair bit now, one of the things I realized was that when we are so enrolled in technology, we inadvertently design out social resilience, that the community simply expect and look to government to provide all of their resilience, right? And I put it to you that resilience, uncertainty, has many components, but there's one component called the unknown unknown. We don't even know what we don't know, which is scary, right? If we know if we know what we don't know, we can at least provide some margins of errors to accommodate that. But if you don't know what we don't know, you can't design for it. And that's where social resilience comes in, that our ability to respond to future uncertainties must include our community being able to take some responsibilities in how they would respond to climatic extremes or disasters and so on. To build that social resilience, knowledge and empowerment holds the key. They need to feel like they contribute to government policy. They need to, through that, they would understand then their role and their responsibility in responding to this. And so that empowerment must come from knowledge and awareness. So in Australia, and I've been working in Indonesia, so much of our work is actually first and foremost raise the knowledge of community, of their awareness to their vulnerability and their exposure. They don't know. Half the population in Australia don't even know where their water comes from. So how would they appreciate the vulnerability of their water supply? They don't know where their sewage goes to. So how would they connect the environmental stewardship that we want to promote them to? So empowerment through knowledge, and then empowerment through participation in co-design processes. Right? And we all, and I've been around long enough to know about public consultation and engagement, and there is the tokenism. But the tokenism is often, we often set our community to fail by saying we're going to rock up and do some co-design. And they have no knowledge. A bunch of experts walk in, and within 1 hour, they would defer to the expert. Because they would not, first of all, say they don't know. They are completely overwhelmed by the technical information. And so they defer. Now, that is not real co-design or empowerment. So, you know, our commitment to raise awareness for them to be true participants is how you build, in my mind, social resilience in that case. And I do believe that Singapore is starting from community expectation that government will solve everything to now progressively them actually understanding that they do in fact have a role in building the citywide resilience. So I hope I've been able to answer that.
Yes, yeah. Please. And also if you could please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, Ian Elliott from University of Glasgow. Thank you so much, Professor Wong, for that absolutely brilliant presentation. That was really inspiring. I'm a co-editor-in-chief of Public Administration and Development, a journal with Dr. Alfred Rue from the Lee Kuan Yew School here. And we specialize in some of the issues that you were talking about. I was glad that you mentioned the challenges of bureaucracy, because you're absolutely right, of course, that in dealing with the climate emergency and in dealing with water governance, often this is, often where that can fail is in how government work, and that focus on inputs instead of outputs. I completely agree. My question for you is, many of these issues, you mentioned we need collaboration between sectors, between different parts of the economy. I think we also probably need collaboration within universities and between universities. These are not issues of a single discipline. You mentioned that you're not a social scientist, but of course, social science also has a key role to play, as do many different disciplines. How do we as academics, and how do universities more broadly, how do you feel we can facilitate more interdisciplinary research? Because that seems to be really key to providing some of the evidence and some of the potential solutions to many of the challenges that you raised. Thank you.
That's a very good question and a very perplexing one, a challenging one as well. I start with making the point that universities are the last bastion of anti-corporatization. Okay, so that fundamentally lies that the problem is that what the Vice Chancellor or the President say generally doesn't influence how the professors want to do their work. Yeah, you know, so that's the last bastion, and we're still hanging on to our individual rights to do what we want to do. Okay, but that's a reality of it. Now, there's a lot to be learned from the UK system, whereby there is now a shift from research excellence through individual assertions to excellence through impact measurement. In Australia, the universities are progressively looking at that. And that will then drive the matrix on how academic excellence are measured, which influence promotions within academia. We're definitely not there yet. And personally, I don't think Singapore universities are even close to that structure. But it doesn't stop us from wanting to try to embark on mission-oriented research. Now, if you just Google, there's a lot being written about that, you know, mission-oriented, wicked problems, the need for interdisciplinary work. How I have been able to make it work in Australia some 10 years ago is first and foremost to seek out all those professors that no longer need to prove anything, right? It's actually not possible to seek out the mid-career researchers and ask them to go interdisciplinary, because it's very confronting to them to suggest that we're taking them on a pathway that there's no matrix to actually capture their contribution to, right? But so in the work that I did on cities some 10 years ago now was that the professors, they have tenure, they've got their Nature publications, they've got nothing to prove, but they've got a great cohort of PhD students as well that will continue their publications, if you're right, okay? I get them in because I needed them to be able to come together to help connect the dots. But, and why it worked there was that in showing some of those professors their significant contribution of their discipline to the common problem, they were able to identify critical research questions that drive their PhD cohort. So the PhD cohorts and the early career researchers continue to dive deep. Professors are able to harness that to a forum, an integrated platform that we can then connect the dots. Right? Now that worked for us because let me tell you this, the solution to many of the wicked problems are already out there. It's just that we haven't been able to connect the dots to harness that. So the tacit knowledge of those professors was a great starting point for me, while in the conversation, those professors of individual disciplines were able to say, there's a knowledge gap that I can actually get some research done to that, which provided pathways for the mid-level researchers. So there is a way to do that. And there are many universities at the highest level, including this university, that wants to do that. But it is, what is the structure and the framework that allows continued demonstration of academic excellence based on the current metrics, right? But still help solve some of the wicked problems that we have today through the interdisciplinary collaboration. So it has been done, it can be done, but also be sympathetic to the notion that mid-career researchers will find it incredibly confronting if you ask them to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ben.
Yeah, thank you. I got a question. First of all, thank you. Wonderful. And everything you've said resonates. Far too many questions. So I want to just zero in on one. By the way, before I do that, on the discussion of Singapore and then more other countries, I noticed in the conservation and environment policy world, there's a big debate between whether you need central authority at a massive scale to do conservation well, or whether actually urban and local areas are better for managing conservation. Big debate in the literature around this, as you know. Both groups point to Singapore as the example of, for their case, right? So Singapore is quite unique in that sense too. It's central authority, but also local. And I think that then needs us to think about how the lessons apply, as you nicely pointed out. But my question is around your last point, and then your first point on the SDGs. On, you said wicked problems, and of course I've been involved in working on super wicked problems. And as part of that framework, which we argue climate change is the most egregious, is this notion of what we call whack-a-mole effects. You know that game, whack-a-mole, where there's a hole that pops up with a mole and you whack the mole, but then that causes a problem somewhere else and a mole pops up somewhere else, you whack that mole, then more problems are created, right? You solve one problem, you create a problem. So I'm wondering, in terms of the SDGs, where a lot of evidence is that this happens, right? You solve one problem, create another. You just mentioned people who couldn't afford air conditioning. But actually, air conditioning causes a problem, which is increased energy use for climate change. So how do you, in your framework, and even in your approach to interdisciplinary engagement, how do you handle the whack-a-mole problem, and where do you see the most important moles to whack?
Yeah, and there lies the broad philosophy that you need to embrace is to not let perfect get in the way of the good. To have interdisciplinary group that is able to present at least some insight on all the potential unintended outcomes is actually incredibly useful, because ultimately, collectively, we need to actually say which is the least bad outcome from there. And then also, how do you create processes to mitigate some of those unintended consequences, because they are no longer unintended if you knew that this was going to happen because of that. So that dialogue was something that we have never had. When I was operating as an engineer, I never had that dialogue. And therefore, they are unintended consequences that you have not planned for. We now are at least able to put together the type of mitigating strategies for that kind of outcomes to occur. Because in the end of the day, it is a value judgment. Right? There are no perfect, and there's a value judgment to that. So, and I was in an NUS discussion just 2 days ago when we talk about building a digital twin to game, because one of the things is that, you know, stationarity is gone. We can't rely on statistics. We can only rely on scenario planning and all that. And I think community really becomes really important. And I make the point that that's great to build a digital twin, but does the digital twin actually include a layer that actually reflects community? Because community are not mono. They respond to situations significantly, right? And the short answer is no, we don't. And so I said, well, there lies the problem, is that you can build a digital twin and develop infrastructure solutions and infrastructure programming to optimize your economic return on investment and all of that. But if you actually don't understand how the community operates, you can't answer the question that if I invest in community resilience, could I defer some of those infrastructure investments because, you know, you can actually be done. And sure enough, someone said, hey, hang on, complexity theory is actually around, that already are out there to model community choice in modality types. They make decisions on that. I said, well, let's capture that because the way forward in a lot of this, understanding unintended consequences and outcomes, is actually through scenario planning and modeling in a multidisciplinary space. To say, if I did this, what are the flow-on effect? And the flow-on effect must include how the community would respond to that, because ultimately, that is the flow-on effect that counts. Yeah? So I think a huge challenge for a lot of us is to be able to truly bring together that social technical inquiry. And that's where researchers actually have a real role in. That's where, you know, I'm sure you do it in terms of looking at policy impact modeling. But the policy impact modeling has got to have such a strong social dynamics layer to it. So I don't know whether that answers your question, because the reality is that there will be flow-on effects, some positive and some negative. And for those negative, if you are aware of it, it's no longer the unknown, it's the known unknown, and we can actually plan for it.
A last question, please.
Thank you very much, Prof. And it's really always interesting to hear Prof. Wong last year in Bali and again today. So I have a question that builds upon two instances that I've experienced in the past 2 years or so. By the way, I'm Gaurav. I'm a second-year master's student here at Public Policy. So the first is the idea that you also brought in, that politics drives and the elections drive the agenda in most developing countries. So I was involved on developing the water policy for one of the states back in India. We drafted it and submitted it for the Legislative Assembly. It was tabled in the Assembly but couldn't get through because the elections came up. And then the new government came in of the same party, and then it was shelved. The same thing happened with a vision plan that I was working on from the think tank that I was part of for 2047, and we included these principles of collaboration and modeling, that the scenario planning and modeling that you just mentioned. But again, the same thing happened, elections happened, and then it was all shelved out. The second instance was recently at the Bali World Water Forum.
I'm sorry, could we please leave it to the first part? The reason is because we have to take, we have to finish on time.
Yeah,
and I think the first question is already already requires...
It's just one question, actually.
No.
Yeah.
If we can take that part, please, because we have to finish on
Right,
time.
okay. So basically my question is, what can youth do when policies don't even take shape and there are daily bread and butter issues for most of the youth in most developing countries? And you also had that as point too.
And look, maybe we could discuss this further offline, but I just finish with this message that to effect change, you need a cohort of champions, and they need to be in different sectors, all actually working for you. The bureaucrats in government, the researchers in the university, the politicians. And in the end of the day, it is actually having that network of champions that is really essential to do this. Now, I come back to what's my job. My job is to provide the evidence and to provide a compelling narrative that people can work with. That's my job. The bureaucrat, the senior bureaucrat's job is to actually influence the right political people to do that. But if it's not true, if it can't get through Parliament, quite often it's really hard. But the minute it actually gets to Parliament, you find that, and I found that the senior bureaucrats protect it jealously. Yeah? And so that champion is there. But I just finished with the notion that in the end of the day, what I found work was really to find kindred spirit across multiple sectors and create that network of champions.
So then with this, we finish. Again, I would like to join everybody else to thank you for such an inspiring lecture, and let's just give Professor Wong a hand.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to the panelists. May we invite them to the front of the stage for a group photography, please. For our festival audiences, there is a lunch break now until 3:15 p.m. You may return back to this session for the next session at 3:15 p.m.